Boldwood presents So It Began, written by Owen Mullen, and read by Robert G. Slade. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. The Little Louisiana Pageant, Whitfield Center, Baton Rouge. Timmy Donald waited to be introduced. He wasn't nervous. Timmy was a round-faced cherub, kiss-curled and confident, a tiny robot programmed to perform, and at 5, already a veteran. The MC gave him a big build-up. From East Baton Rouge, a homeboy paying his tribute to one of the greatest entertainers of all time, Timmy Donald. The red velvet curtain parted, leaving Charlie Chaplin in the spotlight, lost, unsure, and vulnerable. Timmy played it to a T, cocking his head to one side, leaning both hands on his stick. The face of a comic genius gazed out of the golden light. A single note gave him his key, and the spot followed the diminutive performer through a show of stagecraft beyond his years. A piano track, played without finesse, tinkled in the background. Timmy brought the walking stick into action in vintage Chaplin-esque. He scrunched his shoulders and tipped his bowler, letting it run down his arm, a weak smile revealing the courage of the little tramp beset by cruel misfortune. He sang "Smile," and the audience loved him. At the end of the song, he twirled, walked his Charlie walk, and shuffled towards the back of the stage. The spotlight died, the curtains closed, the lights came up. Timmy's father was pleased. All the hard work, the day-after-day rehearsals had paid off. That trick with the hat had taken months to get right. Worth it, though. "You can't put it out if you don't put it in," Tom Donald reminded his son every chance he got. The old jazz musician's maxim about the value of practice appealed to him. Timmy's performance shouted its truth. He was the winner for sure. Everybody said so. "We can't find him." Claudine Charlton couldn't believe it. It had been going so well. A good crowd, no hiccups, no tantrums, even one or two who might have something. Not as good as the Chaplin kid, but not bad. She watched Alec Adams giving out instructions. He'd been with her for years, from the very first contest, and she would be first to admit that when it came to stage management, there was nobody better. They had been married once, a very long time ago. Claudine never let herself forget that he was a snake. Alec shook his head. No sign. "Did you ask his parents?" His father thought we had him. In a room off to the side, the judges sat round a beat-up table drinking coffee. Claudine didn't knock. The interruption took them by surprise. "We have the final result, Claudine." "Who won?" "The little boy." "Forget it. He's out of the running. We need another decision, and fast. Bump everybody on a place. That'll give us a new winner. Stick any of them in third. It doesn't matter. The cowgirl. The crowd liked her. She'll do. Okay? 2 minutes." "But she was awful." "No," Claudine stared the objector down. "She was third." Alec met her behind the stage. "Cops are here, and the father. Somebody needs to speak to him." "What? Oh, yeah." She ran a hand through her hair in quiet desperation. "What do I tell him? What can I say?" "Reassure him." "You do it. You speak to him." "It's your show, and I'm busy. You're the boss, remember?" She hurried towards a guy in an ill-fitting suit. Had to be a cop, talking to Timmy's father. Uniforms covered the stage door. The front was already closed. "Mr. Donald, Claudine Charlton." Timmy's father was too upset to reply. She placed a comforting hand on his arm and spoke to the policeman. "I'm in charge. What do you need to know?" When did you notice the kid was missing?" The policeman glanced at Tom Donald and walked back his tactless question. "I mean, when did you notice Timmy was missing?" 20 minutes ago. He was one of the last to go on. Once they've done their thing, the contestants stay in the dressing rooms. No wandering around until we announce the winners." "It sounds fine, so how come he's gone?" "Wish I knew." The detective gave an order to a sergeant. "Start interviewing. We need ID, names, and addresses. It's going to be a long night." Claudine said, "Is there anything I can do?" "Start looking." "What about the show?" He didn't answer her. "Shouldn't we go with the final ceremony? Keep it normal?" "Good idea. Finish the thing. Nobody's going home for a while." 1 hour later, a locked store cupboard in a back room was the only place that hadn't been searched. The detective wasn't prepared to wait for a key. He barked his instructions. "Break it open." 2 uniforms forced the door. The wood frame cracked and splintered and gave under the pressure. In his career, the cop had come across plenty of bad stuff. That didn't make it easier. The color drained from his face, and he knew he'd been doing this shit for too many years. Time to take the pension, kick back and go fishing. But for now, he was the officer in charge. So he made himself look at the horror guaranteed to keep him awake at night long after he'd turned in his gun and badge. Stuffed in at the back, on top of paint pots and dust sheets, was a broken Charlie Chaplin doll that used to be Timmy Donald. And so it began. Part 1. Summer in the City. Chapter 1. Julian Boot threw his cards on the table face down so the FBI agents didn't see his winning hand. "Beats me," he said. "I'm out." He yawned, scratched the heavy stubble on his jaw, and stood. The agents ignored him and concentrated on the game. They'd been in the safe house since before the start of the trial, now 10 days in, and were battling boredom. Their level of alertness had fallen. The prisoner was becoming part of the furniture. They called him Julie, talked football, and showed him photographs of their kids, while he faked interest and lost at blackjack to keep them happy. Occasionally, they baited him because they could, and Boot acted uptight as if the consequences of testifying against his former boss, Beppe Littleman Giordano, the head of one of the oldest crime families in the South, made him nervous. It didn't. Boot and Giordano hadn't seen each other in 7 years, not since Boot was convicted and sent to Angola. But the thick-set felon was a ghost from the past, the last man the accused would want in court. Julian knew where the bodies were buried, literally. He'd put some of them in the ground himself. If he took the stand, it was all over for Little Man. With Boot's testimony, the FBI would close down his operation and give him a one-way ticket to the farm. As for Julian Boot, he would be handed back to the U.S. Marshals and swallowed by the Witness Protection Program. In a month, a guy who looked a lot like him would be pumping gas in Oregon, or somewhere far from Louisiana. That was the deal. Boot had been removed from the penitentiary for his own protection, and it was common knowledge Giordano's men were searching for him. The mafia boss should have known he had nothing to worry about from his former employee. Boot paced the floor. Over at the window, he fingered the blind. Sammy, the fat fed, remembered he had a job to do and spoke without taking his eyes off the 2 aces he was preparing to split. "You know the rules, Julie. Sit down and chill." The agents had seemed distracted, but the admonishment meant they hadn't switched off completely. Boot stayed in character. "Yeah? Easier said." The other agent, a bald guy called Maurice, enjoyed himself at his expense. "What's the matter? Can't wait to be washing those cars. Shine 'em up good now, you hear? He's scared his pal Bepe's coming round to cool him out." The agents sniggered into their cards. Boot pretended to be irritated and slumped into an armchair. He turned the television on and listlessly began surfing the early evening channels. Fat Boy wasn't done. "Stick with the cartoons, all right? Stay away from the news, Julie. Your ugly mug'll be on every channel between here and the Gulf soon enough." Maurice tossed in his 2 cents. "Don't blame me for being nervous. Giordano's going to be awful pissed when you start blabbing. Introducing him to the electrician at Angola won't go down well. Might not speak to you again." The agents laughed and dealt a fresh hand. Their coats hung on the chairs behind them, and their sleeves were rolled up. Holstered weapons rested against crumpled shirts. Underneath the table, Maurice had his shoes off and was whistling out of tune. For all the world, just buddies at the regular Tuesday night meet, instead of law enforcement officers guarding the protection's star turn. Boot let them have their fun. The more relaxed they were, the easier it would be. He complained on cue. "When's dinner? I'm hungry." "Too soon. Have some potato chips." "Sick of potato chips." "Then suit yourself." The split aces delivered. Fatso grinned and pulled his winnings towards him. He pitched $1 across to Boot. It landed on the carpet between them. "A contribution towards your new life, Julian, or whatever you're going to call yourself." "Shove it up, you ass." Fat Boy was better at dishing it out than taking it. "You're an ungrateful fucker. You realize that, Julie? With what you've done, they should have thrown the key away. Instead, you're sailing free." "Is that what I'm doing?" "Too right, free and clear." Julian imagined the wall behind Fatso splashed with blood and bone after he blew a hole in the bastard's skull. Boom, boom, boom. At 7, a knock on the door and an exchange of passwords meant the food had arrived. The game was abandoned. The agents opened the boxes. "Pizza again? Doesn't the budget run to anything else?" Boot complained. "Maybe somebody doesn't share your sense of importance. Eat it or don't eat it, your choice." "I'm just saying, does it always have to be junk? It gives me stomachache." Maurice shook his bald head at his partner. "And they told us this was a tough guy." They ate in silence, tearing off pieces of red dough and stuffing them into their mouths until the boxes were empty. Boot didn't join in. Maurice wiped his hands on his pants and went to the kitchen to make coffee. From what he'd seen so far, Boot was a loser, a low-energy nobody with an undeserved reputation. Riding him never got old. Fat Sam rubbed his belly and spoke, spraying grated Parmesan across his prisoner. "Gotta eat, man. Keep up your strength for when Bepe's thugs come bursting through that door and drag you away." Boot tapped out a gitan and lit it. The fat man said, "Heard something once, way down the line, about what Giordano did to a traitor." Maurice came back with the coffee. "Don't tell him, Sammy. He'll go running back to Angola." Sammy smiled. "Too late. Options off the table. Wouldn't last a day." Maurice agreed. "Lucky if he lasted an hour." Boot drew on his smoke and stared at the floor. It was 8 o'clock. Almost time. The overweight agent studied him. "Nah, best Julie realizes where it's at. Anyway, the guy's name was Foy, Narcisse Foy. Ever heard of him?" Boot ignored the question. "Took him into the bayou, stripped him naked, and tied him to a big old Spanish oak. Then they got to work on him. According to the story, one of Giordano's men had trained as a chef. He showed the others what was what." Sammy savored the details. "Started at his toes and worked their way up. Didn't stop until it was done. Skinned him alive, then dumped him in the water for the gators." He paused and pointed. That's who you're about to fuck with." The ash on Julian Boots' cigarette was a tiny gray finger. His hand was steady, as steady as it had been in the bayou 15 years ago, after he'd given up on the idea of becoming the next Emeril Lagasse. And Fatso had it wrong. They'd taken the hide off Narcisse Foy in 2 long sessions, though on the second, he hadn't known much about it. Boot wondered what had happened to the knife. It would be perfect for trimming the fat on this moron. He flicked the ash on the carpet and followed it to the floor with his eyes. "It's a myth." The agent hooked his thumbs inside his belt and let his chin settle on his chest. "Maybe so. Maybe so. But what if it isn't, Julie? You ready to die that hard? Oh, and just so we're straight, if they come for you, I won't stand in their way." Boot got out of his chair. "Any more scary tales?" "No. I'm gonna shake hands with an old friend." Alone, he revisited the plan. The next shift would arrive at 7 a.m. 10 hours. More than enough time to cover the 80 miles to New Orleans. When he came back into the room, the agents were watching a quiz show on television. They paid no attention to their charge. Boot walked up behind Maurice. He reached over the man's shoulder, grabbed his gun from the holster, and shot him in the neck, severing his spinal cord. His partner struggled to get his bulky frame out of the seat, fumbling for his weapon. A bullet in the knee ended his attempt. He howled and cried like a baby. "This is a mistake, Julie!" "Think so?" A second bullet destroyed the fat man's other knee, and he roared. "Talking of mistakes, Sammy, what Narcisse got wasn't Bepe's idea." Through the pain, the agent's face twisted in disbelief. You were there!" "Shame you never got to try my blackened card. Some reckoned it was as good as the plate at the commander's palace." The third shot shattered the FBI agent's collarbone. Boot ignored the screams and took aim. He'd save his head till last. "Could be I'm in the wrong business. For sure, one of us is." Chapter 2. It rained during the night. Hard rain that cut the stifling air and drummed on the roof, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. But by that time, along with half of New Orleans, I was awake. Lowell sensed I was in the land of the living and padded through. "Good morning, Mutt. When you going to learn how to make coffee?" That would be a trick I could use. Some people had kids to save their relationship. I'd bought my fiancée, Ellen Ames, a dog, a tan mongrel with white paws and the deep eyes of an old soul. He was in a pet shop window in Basin when I saw him, and while his brothers and sisters rolled all over each other, he sat at the back, aloof and apart. His expression said he was too fucking cool for any of that shit. Unfortunately, the relationship didn't work out, and when we split, Lowell wound up with me. Even as a pup, he was a creature of habit, starting every day the same, with porridge. No sugar, no milk. If it had been down to me, I would have fed him from a tin like a regular dog. He had other ideas. I sipped black coffee, ate a bagel, and watched him lick the bowl clean. Then he picked my harmonica up in his teeth and dropped it at my feet. His way of saying he wanted us to cycle into the city. With me vamping on a harmonica on a holder round my neck and Lowell running along beside me and wagging his tail, I guess we were quite a sight. If I hit a bum note, he gave me a look. He's got a good ear for this stuff. My sister Catherine swears I'm eccentric. I disagree, although a 6-foot guy riding a bike and blowing the blues for a music-loving hound isn't something you see very often. In the quarter, Shopkeepers were already setting up for the next wave of tourists. Outside a cafe, a black cook with a cheroot hanging from his mouth leaned on the frame of the door. He smiled as we passed him, wiped a hand on his whites, and shouted his appreciation. "Yeah, I hear you, brother." At Dauphin, I chained the bike to the railing at the bottom of the wooden stairs and climbed to my one-room office. As usual, the paperboy had used the Times-Picayune to improve his throwing action. The newspaper lay at the door where it had landed. Inside, Lowell headed for his basket. First up, I phoned Stella. Usually we spent the weekend together, but on Sunday night a friend had needed her. "Hi, baby. Missed you last night. How's your friend?" "Better. Hates every man born. Who can blame her?" "You don't mean that." "Lucky for you." We chatted for a while, then I made coffee and scanned the paper. 2 copies of the Times-Picayune, one for home and one for the office, was overkill. But I like what I like. The news had moved on from the 5-year-old kid abducted and murdered at a pageant up in Baton Rouge. At the time, details were scarce. I hadn't read them, and I didn't envy the detectives working on the case. That kind of stuff was one good reason for getting out of the NOPD. The start of the football season was still weeks away. I settled down with my current obsession, the word jumble. Today's puzzle was a beauty. I read the letters aloud to Lowell. REPDHAOTI. Any ideas? He thought about it. REPDHAOTI. Lowell was better at this than me, but I preferred to get there by myself. Around 10:30, a call from Harry Love, a defense lawyer who hired me to do work for him from time to time, interrupted our attempts to crack it. Harry was a lawyer and a liar by trade, who tossed work my way, mostly uncovering information that wouldn't appear in the usual background checks. He was a man of few words, who made a point of ending every conversation first, to let people know that in his world, time was money. In mine, it was only time. Most of our talking was done over the phone. Harry knew as much about me as I did about him, which suited both of us. "How's your dance card, Delaney?" "It could stand a little filling in. What do you want?" "Just checking you're still in business." "Still am, Harry." "Good to know. I'll be in touch." And he was gone. I went back to the word jumble, scribbling one failed attempt after another in the margin and crossing them out. Lowell stared from the comfort of his basket, telling me in his quiet way he thought I should be, at least, trying to keep the wolves from the door. Overreacting. We hadn't died a winter yet, and I was doing what I was born to do. Not very much. 3 hours went by before the phone rang a second time. Danny Fitzpatrick. Fitzy was a detective with the NOPD and played bass in our band. He didn't bother with small talk. "An old friend of yours is back on the street." "Yeah? Who?" "Julian Boot." "Impossible. He's in Angola." "Not anymore. Made a deal in exchange for calling time on his old boss." The trial had been front-page news for a week and a half. I hadn't read it. As far as I was concerned, it was nothing to do with me. I was done. "You said back on the street?" "That's right. They were keeping him in a safe house in Baton Rouge until he was needed. Never got that far. Boot killed 2 feds and busted out. What a shitstorm that's caused. Everybody's been pulled in." "When was this?" "Last night. He's here, and we both know why. Julie Boot's a Class A bad guy with a grudge against the whole world, especially you. He's a psycho. He'll have obsessed about what you did to him every day he's been inside. Testifying against his boss was a ploy to get to you." I sighed, and Danny snapped at me. "Take this seriously, Delaney." I am taking it seriously. But worrying never changed anything, did it? Says who? You're the guy who put his nuts brother in the ground, in case you've forgotten. Fitzy faded. The voice in my head belonged to an old detective and the speech he'd made at his retirement party. Sometimes the line between good shit and bad shit is invisible. Can't know which side you're on till the game plays out. I've always remembered that, and I hadn't forgotten Julian Boot either. 7 years earlier. On that sunny afternoon, the bad shit showed up first. My shift had finished, and I'd already dropped Danny off when the radio crackled an APB about a 2002 tan Oldsmobile with a broken headlight and 3 occupants, 2 African-American males and a female, suspected abduction. A minute later, the Olds passed me, heading towards the river. I called it in, made a U-turn, and followed it all the way to Algiers and Behrman, north of Tall Timbers. For a while, I lost it, then found it again, parked behind a shotgun shack on a patch of ratty grass that doubled as a garbage dump. From inside the house, a high-pitched laugh that didn't make it past a giggle squeezed through the clapboard to where I crouched underneath the window. Across the yard, a barefoot kid, no more than 5 or 6, dressed in washed-out overalls, stared at me with big, round, almond eyes. I put a finger to my lips, hoping he was in the mood to play along, and took a look over the frame. In the middle of the room, tied to a chair, a woman who was probably in her mid-20s, dark-skinned and stick-thin, glared terror at her kidnappers from sunken eyes strung out on crystal meth. She was gagged, and her head had been crudely shaved. Clumps of hair lay on the floor, and the yellow shirt she'd been wearing hung from her waist, exposing sagging breasts that may have been beautiful before fear of losing her buzz became more important than eating. 2 black men in jeans and vests drank beer from the bottle, one of them balancing a knife by the tip in the palm of his hand and smiling a glassy smile at his skill, while his bro boogied to hip-hop coming from a radio. They passed a joint between them big enough to choke a horse, clearly enjoying the groove, easy about what they were going to do. Until that moment, I didn't know Cedric and Julian Boot from a hole in the wall. How much better if it had stayed that way. The guy with the knife moved towards the woman, gently taking her face in his hands, studying her like the lover he'd been or had wanted to be, then traced her cheek with the blade, drawing a thin red line from ear to jaw. Light glanced off the steel. He turned his attention to the other side and did the same. She trembled, but didn't cry out. I admired her courage. Cedric, the dancer, spoke. "Do it slow, Julie. Slow." He dragged the word to make his point and went into a moonwalk that wouldn't have disgraced Michael Jackson. When he pivoted, I saw the gunmetal handle of the piece tucked into the back of his belt and realized it was going to go down hard. Over my shoulder, the street kid was still there. Before he got much older, those big eyes would see plenty of things no child should see. I pressed myself against the wall and listened for a police car in the distance, hearing instead the sound of a zillion insects carried on the warm air. In the house, the woman finally broke her silence. She screamed. The kid's expression didn't change, which told me all I needed to know about his life. The smart thing would be to wait for backup. By that time, the woman would have a new face and it wouldn't matter anymore. Whatever she'd done, she didn't deserve this. The door broke easily against my weight. I rolled on the bare board floor and came to a halt with my arms outstretched and my gun drawn. "Hands in the air, now!" Dulled by the dope, Julian Boot's brow furrowed at the unexpected interruption. Boogeyman reacted faster. He reached behind his back for his weapon, and I fired a shot that blew a hole in his heart. Cedric had boogied his last boogie. He was dead when he hit the ground. His brother put his surprise aside long enough to topple the chair with the woman in it on top of me. Our heads cracked. Boot took a step towards me and kicked my gun across the room. I got to my feet. There was no feeling in my hand. Maybe my wrist was broken. Joy crept slowly across Boot's ugly mug. Somebody was going to die today. The woman had been his first pick, but he'd settle for me. The blade shimmered and flashed, missing my throat by inches. Boot passed it from hand to hand, grinning like a maniac, and brought it in an arc that was intended to distract rather than find a target. Suddenly, he altered the direction and lunged forward. I stepped away. At first I thought he'd missed. Then I felt the back of my neck wet, and the faint smell of metal told me he'd found his mark. Boot's expression hardened. He moved in to finish me off. The siren saved my life. Confusion twisted his features as he weighed his desire to kill me against escape. Self-preservation got the vote. Julie ran to the kitchen, dived through the glass into the afternoon sun, and disappeared into Algiers. The uniforms arrived. Cordite hung in the shotgun, and I was cradling the woman's head in my arms, whispering the usual BS about how it was going to be all right while she bled out all over my coat. Boot had sliced her windpipe as the chair was going down. She was barely breathing when the medics took over. Outside, the street was crawling with cops. An ambulance, with its engine running and the back doors open, waited to take Boot's victim to hospital. I massaged my hand and saw the kid. He hadn't moved. This was the world he lived in. Nothing in it was news to him. For the record, the woman didn't make it. The impatience in Danny's voice brought me back into the now. Are you even listening? Don't underestimate this guy. In Boot's crazy head, you fucked his life up. It was the other way around. He doesn't see it that way. Until we get him, I'm putting a couple of men on you. Think you're overreacting. Fitz quit trying to convince me and went quiet. When he spoke again, he was closer to the truth than I wanted to admit. You seem less than surprised, like you've been expecting him to come after you. Sooner or later, the circle gets squared. Metaphysics didn't impress him. Get that from Deepak Chopra? It's total bullshit. Julie Boot has carried a grudge against you for 7 years. Yeah, he can join the club. His frustration boiled over. Do the right thing. Do right, Delaney. Ever known me to do anything else? That was when the line went dead. Chapter 3. The car park filled from early Saturday morning. Harassed parents streamed from stationary vehicles, trailing nervous performers, lugging bags, costumes on hangers protected by cellophane, and the rest of their brood. The event itself was a local affair. Overhead, clear skies promised a fine summer day. The oppressive humidity of recent weeks gone for now. Katie Rinaldi lifted herself up onto the back seat between her mom and her gran. Both women held onto her. Neither tried to stop her climb. This was a big day for her. It was unrealistic to expect her to sit quietly when she could see children making their way to the venue. North of Burgundy Street in the St. Claude district, the community center looked exactly like 100 others. Constructed in the 1970s, it was difficult to believe the architect had billed anyone for his services. Functional described it kindly. Rectangular, more accurately. It was a giant subdivided shoebox with a pitch roof. The windows, whenever they disturbed the charmless character of the structure, were small, square, and barred. An occasional graffiti scrawl of misspelled obscenity brought some relief to the blandness of the design. Katie's dad slowed to maneuver past uptight parents and hyper kids. Here and there a man trailed along, dragged into the vortex by the force of female will. Bob Rinaldi saw none of this. He had his own uptight parent thing going on and silently asked God to let Katie have a good one. When the car stopped, everybody got out. Gran Russell's exit was a good deal more deliberate than her granddaughter's. Katie jumped on the spot, all energy and anticipation. Bob opened the trunk and removed the paraphernalia of pageantry and waited on his own set of instructions from Edie. Katie said, "We're here, Gran." Her grandmother straightened, patted her clothes, and looked clear-eyed at the ugly building, outdated and old before its time. Her reply was a, well, that dripped doubt but dropped short of articulating the deep misgivings she'd had when Edie had told her about Katie and the pageants. "Come on, Mama." Edie was terse. She felt under pressure, from her mother who lived to disapprove, and from herself for ever suggesting the goddamn thing in the first place. To put the tin lid on it, her period was 2 days late. Just something else to chew at her this morning. Fuck. Why did she ever think this was a good idea? Katie skipped and ran ahead. The grown-ups followed at a more sluggish pace, slowed by the lethargy of conflicting emotions. They entered through glass doors lined with metal wire under a sign saying Community Center. Bob Rinaldi looked round the multipurpose facility, tried to stay positive, and saw the kind of activity they'd expected. Adults and children, some as young as 3, milled around an open door. A blonde woman, about 40, in black jeans and a white T-shirt, balanced reading glasses on the end of her nose. A long, thin, white-on-black name tag gave her status as Registration Secretary. She smiled when Edie Rinaldi approached her. "Hi, honey. Have you booked a place in the competition?" "No, I only heard it was happening a few days ago." The woman nodded and smiled at Katie, holding her father's hand, half hidden behind her gran. "No problem. Can I have your name?" "Rinaldi." Bob left public Q&A exchanges to his wife. That way it got done how Edie liked it. The blonde passed a form to his wife. "Fill this in, please." She looked Katie up and down. "How old is she?" "I'm 6. The little girl peeked out to answer for herself, then hid, overwhelmed by self-consciousness. 6? The woman sounded impressed. She knew how the game was played. "Okay, Katie, you're 6, so you'll be in the 6 to 8 years old section." She peered over the specs. "Tough group. Lots of cute." Her look softened. "You'll be all right." Katie kept her face turned away. The woman spoke to her mother. "Down the corridor, second on the right. The show's in the main hall at the end. Your first pageant?" "Yes, it is." "Each group has its own changing room. Valuables are left at your own risk. Someone will come round, collect your CD, and give you timings. Approximate, of course. This is just an itty-bitty thing to give the kids some practice. See if they take to it." Katie still lurked behind her gran. "See if you take to it." She spoke to Edie. "It's best to get her ready, then go in and watch the others till about an hour before performance time." Her forefinger counted them. "1 entrant and 3 spectators. $50, please." Bob counted out the bills and handed them across the table. The blonde woman unzipped a bum bag on her waist and placed them inside. Emily Russell noted how full the bag was. Whatever was itty-bitty about the pageant, it wasn't the money. "Have a good day. Enjoy yourselves. Go get 'em, honey." Katie held her gran's hand until they reached the room. "I'll take Katie in," Edie said. "Get her sorted out. You go to the show. We'll catch up with you." "Right." Bob glanced into the changing room, realizing it was no place for him. He bent down on one knee and took his daughter's small hands in his. "See you soon, baby. You're going to be great." Her reply was a nervous whisper. "Okay, Daddy." Emily Russell's features were cut from granite. She didn't speak. Bob Rinaldi looked at his wife, and Edie wondered for the 100th time what she'd started. Bob and Mama found seats towards the front in an oasis free from children climbing on parents and chairs. Neither spoke. It was going to be a long day. Edie was too preoccupied to think about whether or not she was enjoying herself, or about Bob or Mama. Where she was held enough challenges. Low benches, the kind used in training sessions, were laid out in lines. Competitors left whatever they weren't wearing on stage in little bundles. Valuables are left at your own risk. Katie was very quiet now. Her mother unpacked. A woman, another blonde, the sister of the one at the main door, moved between the chicane of overexcited bodies being marshaled by all-business moms. Name? Rinaldi, Katie Rinaldi. The blonde didn't try to connect with the owner, preferring to address the parent. Her hand scribbled on the paper held tight by the clipboard. Right, she said. The first stage for this group is 11 o'clock. Mr. Darlington will come round an hour before to talk about the sequence and collect your music. Up until then, she looked at her watch, you can stay here or go watch the show, just don't get lost. If you miss the sequencing, you're out of the competition. Understood? What happens after that? Blondie eyed Katie. If you're still in, you'll go through to the final. Her face said she didn't think they needed to worry over much about that. When Edie joined Bob and her mother, the first group was coming to the end of its time. She shuffled along the row with Katie in front. Her husband pulled a sour face. Edie's heart sank. Had the hostilities that had threatened all morning arrived? No, Bob and Mama were all right. Not communicating, but fine. The problem was something else. On stage, a child, no more than a baby, was trying to sing. The audience ignored the tuneless din. Edie leaned across to her husband, while Katie studied the infant competitor. Bob patted his wife's hand. Everything's fine. Enjoy the show. She smiled at his joke. There was nothing else to do. The amateur nature of the event was demonstrated by every contestant for another 30 minutes. Before the judging got underway, the MC, a bald man, ridiculous in a shiny gold jacket, asked the entrants in the 6 to 8-year-old section to go back to their dressing area. Edie took her daughter's hand. Come on, baby. Good luck, honey. Bob's eyes were on his wife. His words meant for all of them. Emily Russell looked at her granddaughter, and her eyes softened. I'm here, Katie. Just do your best and have fun. A knife of resentment stabbed Edie. You're here? Fine. Good. But she's my daughter. I'm her mom, and I'm here. Angry thoughts thundered in her head. When they got to the changing room, it was busy with women dressing unresisting children, fussing over details nobody but them would ever notice, talking non-stop. Listen up, folks. A man in a red polo shirt and dark blue trousers clapped his hands for attention. His face was unremarkable until he smiled. He used his hands and arms to include everyone. My name's Arthur Darlington.